Welcome to EPJ Pathshala. I am Pirzada Rauf and I teach at Jindal Global University. In today's class, we'll be talking about geopolitical treaties and agreements. And here we will deal with the treaties and agreements related to trade, treaties and agreements related to energy, treaties and agreements related to water, treaties and agreements related to climate. So here we'll learn about the origins of the WTO and explain the Paris Agreement and its impact on India, understand the utility of treaty on water between nations, and the keywords here are climate, intellectual property, UN, trade. In treaties and agreements related to trade, the treaties and agreements related to trade traces its origin, 1944 Bretton Woods Conference that leads to the foundations of International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The conference also recommended for a third leg of the international financial system, which they termed as International Trade Organization, commonly known as ITO. All these institutions were established with the common vision, and that is to facilitate the flow of imperial capital across the world. US and UK headed the group which recommended the establishment of International Trade Organization, which culminated into the signing of Havana Charter in March of 1948. But the character never came into being because the US Senate failed to ratify it. Hence, the organization named International Trade Organization remained unborn. In the meantime, another agreement was completed which was in favor of reducing the tariffs on cross-border trades. These made the states to sign the agreement named General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, that is GATT on November 13, 1947. A significant number of states signed the agreement. This agreement provided an alternative to otherwise ineffective ITO, International Trade Organization. Despite being criticized for its encroachment on the state sovereignty, the agreement provided for 8 rounds of multi-trade agreements, which the Uruguay round facilitated establishment of World Bank, which from then have incorporated the GATT agreement in its working committee in the field of establishing the regime of free trade across the globe. Also, World Bank in its legal apparatus has to ensure that the GATT is implemented across the globe. World Bank has consolidated the agreements on trade in more appropriate manner, bringing the economical, ideological ideology of free trade expansionism. It has also set rules for the regime of free trade. From the days of Adam Smith to that of Ricardo, the world has seen changes in the economical concept, from division of labor to the concept of comparative advantage. The world has become more economically integrated in terms of trade and financial relations. This has led to the increase in the legislations for trade across the border and also an increase of trade agreements across the globe. The structural adjustments were done by various governments at their national level so as to facilitate the terms and objectives of World Bank. The growing trend towards the neoliberal trade agreements which facilitate imperial capital penetration across the national borders have not always been smooth. The present state of trade relations at the international level is the manifestation of the cries of the capitalist economies which have led to the change in the exploitative stage from one level to another, which at the present time imperialism in the disguise of globalization, and for which we have whole superstructure constituting of law at the national and the international level, and the trade agreements are the manifestations of the same. Intellectual property rights and free trade agreements. The growth of the new imperialism has brought a trend in the world trade where the commodification has grown to the maximum. To the maximum level in order to facilitate the imperial design of accumulation by primitive mode. This manifestation of politico-economic trend is the growth of intellectual property rights and the growth of trade-based adventures on such rights. Every set of commodification brings the object into the ongoing matrix of base and superstructure. The growth of laws in intellectual property is to be seen in the same light. After the Doha round, the developed first world countries began to promote two types of agreements, one on the free trade and other on the investment protection. Both of these helped the monopoly capital by establishing larger duration for the coverage of the rights related to intellectual property and also by widening the scope for their rights. These provisions can be different types in the international legislation on intellectual property, both at the detriment of developing or underdeveloped countries. It is interesting to note that the imperialist countries like US and the countries in West European Union have always been readily available to sign agreements on free trade regimes. This indicates the nature of such agreement and also as to who is going to benefit from such agreements. United States and the European Union have signed free agreements on the intellectual property rights with third world developing countries like India. The free trade agreements which have been signed with the European Union, have been signed with South Korea, have contained the following provisions about intellectual property rights. In these provisions, we talk about or we have extending the duration of medicinal patents for as many as 5 years beyond the 20 years already provided for the TRIPS, that is the agreements on the trade related aspects of intellectual property, commonly known as TRIPS. Exclusive protection for the test data on drugs and agrotoxics, a new form of protection that directly impedes generic drugs from entering the market. This legal provision did not exist in the TRIPS and was deliberately excluded that the negotiation but was included in a US agreement with Central America and the Dominican Republic. The provision reduces the flexible terms of the TRIPS that otherwise make it possible for the countries to recognize test data to approve a generic drug, adding new trade obligations such as protecting digital rights management DRM, that use of technology to regulate the number of times a work in digital format may be used and the conditions of use. Such restrictive technical measures can, for example, track usage to determine whether a work has been copied, loaned, read or more times, shared or even printed in the case of text in some legal systems such as Digital Millennium Copyright Act of United States. Evading these technical measures is a crime, even when done to exercise a right such as access to work in the public domain or fair use. The treaty and the agreements related to energy. According to Paris Climate Agreement, a rapid decrease in the world's consumption of fossil fuels is now mandatory if the earth is to be saved from climate disaster. We have predictions and projections of the future energy use. However, there are unanimous predictions where we talk about increase in the world's consumption of fossil fuels in coming decades. Either the energy consumption and the projections are wrong or the Paris goal is unachievable. The post reviews of the basic provisions of the Paris Agreement compare them with 6 independent estimates of future energy consumption and concludes that while the energy consumption estimates are subject to uncertainty, the goal of Paris Agreement are indeed unachievable. The Paris climate agreement, where we talk about the magnitude of the task facing the Paris signatories, is illustrated as no action scenario supposedly leads to a disastrous warning by 2011. There is no compelling scientific evidence that it will, but the Paris signatories have decreed that it will. A scenario under which all the countries that have filed intended nationally determined contributions meet their targets, which is unlikely leads to 3.5 Celsius of warming. The 2 Celsius pathway considered necessary to stave off the worst impacts of climate change is nowhere near being met. And the energy agreement for the sustainable growth of Netherlands works with the aim to make world more sustainable as its members across the globe, which combines the neorealist paradigm with the human security framework. Energy supply has to be sustainable in order to imagine a sustainable world. This agreement is the joint work of people with diverse expertise and interest sections. It includes states, environments, friendly groups, employee associations, and even the local level of governing bodies, which is based on thinking that the common good of each is to be achieved in compliance with the nature's power of renewal. The combination of the private and the public players in the single organization have made the organization more concerned about the needs of the present and thereby to look for more sustainable energy sources. The support by the legislative body of Netherlands have helped the organization develop a sustainable form of energy source. The Social and Economic Council of Netherlands, SER, acts as the platform to facilitate the agreement on energy for the sustainable growth. Through a report named Towards an Energy Agreement for Sustainable Growth that was adopted on 16th November 2012, the conference culminated into an agreement of sustainability as an alternative to the energy sources. The agreement reached out was the result of more than 6 months of negotiation by the participants of more than 40 member associations. Various stakeholders participated in the meeting and brought out an agreement on the basis of multiple interest and sustainability of the nation. All these agreements facilitated Netherlands' move towards the sustainable source of energy. 100% use of wind energy in the Dutch trainways is an example of efficient use of sustainable energy source. This has been possible due to efficient planning and the work of agreement among the different interest groups inside the country. The treaties and agreements related to water. The growth of exploitative economic measures have resulted in decline in quality and quantity of water. The thirst towards commodification and the extent of capitalist overproduction has resulted into scarcity of water. This scarcity is in both quantity and quality. The river which flows across national boundaries have become the hotspot of politics among the rising nation states. It should be understood that war over universal resources like water by a nation state would result into overlooking the human security framework of the hydropolitics. Under these circumstances, agreements for the cooperation on sharing of river would cater the need of different stakeholders. Diplomacy can be a tactic to handle the water disputes, and the world have seen how diplomatic relationships have solved the problems concerning 2 or more nation states. In the last 50 years, there have been signing of more than 150 agreements related to water sharing. States too look forward for such agreements as this results in stability in the basin or and also facilitates states' engagement with other issues of national importance. The history of agreements over the international source can be traced to 2500 BC, between when the two Sumerian states of Langsh and Umma crafted an agreement that ended water dispute along the Tigris River. After which large number of such treaties have surfaced. According to Food and Agriculture Organization, after 805 AD, more than 3600 treaties related to international water resources have been made. Large number of these treaties deal with boundary, demarcations and navigation issues. The growth of imperial mode of production have resulted in the changing of the focus from boundary demarcation to that of use of distribution and appropriation of the water resources. The legal agreements on water usage have been made sometimes on the intervention of the World Bank, while at the other by way of movements to consider human interests involved in water conflicts. It has also been possible due to the realist approach in water resource management. Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam are in cooperation with each other through Mekong River Commission, Even during the Vietnam War, they have had technical exchanges with each other. We have seen in Jordan, between Jordan and Israel, they also have a water treaty. The Indus Water Commissions is intact despite 2 to 3 wars between India and Pakistan. The Nile River Basin framework was agreed on, the framework to reduce poverty, to accelerate economic development and to ensure that water resource is used for common good of the world's citizens. The Niger River Basin framework is also on the similar basis. These cases reflect two needs for the water agreement. One is the need of an independent third party having the water power of sanction but not with an Austinian sense of law, and the other is the need for looking at the broader structural means with respect to universal nature of rivers. The 3600 agreements on water are the reflection of growing concerns for the agreements, but these agreements have to be seen in the light of broader geopolitics as well as hydropolitics. Presence of agreements doesn't guarantee absence of conflicts. The local hegemon in the basin is always in the position to appropriate water resource in the way as to harm the interest of its co-riparian state or the lower riparian. This becomes more likely when an organization like the World Bank, which has favored almost all takeover of the resources by the imperial capitalists, becomes a partner to the agreement, has reached between two co-riparian states. United Nations Convention on Non-Navigational Sources of International Water Courses of 1997 is one of the norms set up by the international community that looks on the matter of water sharing. It laid down two norms that would guide the countries having their interest in river basin: equitable and reasonable use, the obligation not to cause significant harm. Treaties with the UN General Assembly Resolution on Law of Transboundary Aquifers. The General Assembly, through its resolution ARES 63-124, laid down norm to guide the states in their concentrated transboundary aquifers. It contains provisions as to make appropriate bilateral or regional arrangements for the proper management of their transboundary aquifers. Taking into account the provisions of these draft articles, which are annexed to the resolution, the provisions also require mutual cooperation among the states so as to reduce the level of pollution to the aquifers and thus to maintain the quality of it. Seeing the importance of the invisible resource, states are required under this resolution to consider the norms laid down in this as final. This law has helped in great degree to solve the water disputes in the peaceful way and thus paving the way forward for an equitable share of global resources. Before this, there was no international law that would guide the states in their relation with other states with sharing the transboundary aquifers. Declaration of year 2013 as International Year of Water Cooperation. The General Assembly, its move to celebrate 2013 as Water Cooperation Year, have stimulated the states to think in terms of cooperation, and it has encouraged the states having conflicting transboundary water issues to go for a peaceful, amicable solution. The Convention for the Non-Navigational Use of International Watercourses. This is the only treaty that has universal application. It is concerned with the sharing of freshwater bodies. It sets the rules and principles that guide the state when they interact with each other or the other state in terms of appropriating transboundary water resources. The key principles that the document provides are: first, the equitable and the reasonable utilization of international watercourse, the application of appropriate resources and measures to prevent harm to other states sharing an international watercourse, and principle of prior notification of planned measures. The celebration of World Water Day 2009, the World Water Day had a theme: shared waters, shared opportunities. This was done to bring the sense of cooperation among the states to promote cooperation for management of transboundary water resources. This was based on the principle of equity. The common cause behind sustainable use of such resource was also reflected in the declaration of World Water Day. The United Nations World Thematic Priority Area on Transboundary Waters. This TFA is to bring a platform for cooperation among the water states so that to settle the disputes regarding transboundary water resources, its management and its use and distribution. This is to be done by creating a space for the exchange of information and experience. The treaty or the treaties and agreements related to climate, the ever increasing, unsatisfying greed of the capital accumulation and the contradiction between accumulation and environment, limit to accumulation, have surfaced in the form of climate change and variation. The major agreement that shows the concern of international community over this issue is United Nations Framework Convention on Climatic Change, UNFCCC. This convention was adopted during Rio Earth Summit in 1992. Over 195 countries have given their assent to this convention. It provided the platform for the states across the globe to work in order to stop the global rise in the temperature and also to check the climate change. The signatories of this convention took following steps to further the agreement. 1. Ratified the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement. The Kyoto Protocol, in the mid-1990s, the United Nations FCCC signatories realized that stronger provisions were needed to see a decline in carbon emissions. They agreed for a protocol named Kyoto Protocol that called for a legally binding norm for the developed countries to reduce carbon emission. The agreement came into force in 1997. The period from 1997 to 2013 is also termed as the first commitment period of Kyoto Protocol. The second commitment period of Kyoto Protocol began in 2013 and would end in 2020. The participating countries include 38 developed countries and 28 countries of European Union. The period includes the Doha Declaration, in which states have agreed to reduce carbon emission by 18% less than that of 1990 level, while the EU bears the responsibility to reduce 20% of the carbon emission from the 1990 level. The main problem with the protocol is that the developed countries are not held accountable. In fact, there is no mechanism to hold them accountable to this emission standard, and also the loss what they cause to the global climate and its sustainability. The protocol applies only to the 14% carbon emissions, as the major imperialist economies are not signatories of this protocol. Paris Climate Change Conference. On 12 December 2015, the Paris Conference concluded that the signatories would be limiting the climate change by 2%. The agreement will come into force only when 55 countries that accounts for 55% of the global emissions have ratified it. European Union Council. The Union Council covers a vision to reduce the carbon emission by 40% in domestic sector by 2030. Meeting in the Council on 6 March 2015, environment ministers discussed preparations for the Paris Conference. The members collectively agreed on 23 October to reduce the greenhouse gas emission. The EU prepared intended nationally determined contribution (INDC) for the new global climate agreement. They were the first to communicate their INDC to United Nations FCCC on 6 March 2015. In the summary, we have the treaties and the agreements related to trade traces its origin to 1944, that is Bretton Woods Conference, that led to the foundations of International Monetary Fund and World Bank. The conference also recommended for a third leg for the international financial system, which they termed as ITO, International Trade Organization. All of these institutions were established with the common vision, and that is to facilitate the flow of imperial global capital to the world. According to Paris Climate Agreement, a rapid decrease in the world's consumption of the fossil fuel is now mandatory if the Earth is to be saved from climate disaster. Projections of the future energy use, however, are unanimous in predicting an increase in the world's consumption of fossil fuels in coming decades. The thirst towards commodification and the extent of capitalist overproduction has resulted into scarcity of water. This scarcity is in both quantity and quality. The rivers which flow across national boundaries have become the hot spots of politics among the rising nation states. It should be understood that war over natural resources or universal resources like water by nation states would result in overlooking the human security framework of hydropolitics. Thank you.